Thank you very much. It's very daunting to come on stage after Tariq Ramadan, but I'll try to do what I can. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his On the Social Contract, on the very last pages of his work, he wrote, and I quote directly, "Those who distinguish between civil and theological intolerance are mistaken, in my opinion. Those two types of intolerance are inseparable. It is impossible to live in peace with those one believes to be damned. To love them would be to hate the God who punishes them. It is absolutely necessary to either reclaim them or torment them. Whenever theological intolerance is allowed, it is impossible for it not to have some civil effect." End quote. Now, one thing that these quotes prove is that the issue of salvation is not merely a theoretical one. Rather, it goes to the very core of a person's values, of how he will define and treat the other. Therefore, this topic, this issue, has philosophical, theological, civil, moral, and political ramifications. However, we can't discuss all of them in any one lecture, and I'm coming to the podium primarily as a theologian or a theologian in training. So I will have to approach this issue purely from the theological dimension. My talk will be divided into two sections, followed by a conclusion. In the first section, I will point out the positions of the main theological movements of our religion, Islam, regarding salvation, and the primary Quranic evidences that they use to justify that position. In the second section, I will examine specific evidences that some modern reformists have used to argue against the classical understanding of salvific inclusivity for salvific exclusivity. In my conclusion, I will offer some personal comments on the issue. So part one, the overview of the theological positions of Islam on salvific inclusivity versus exclusivity. It shall come as no great surprise to anybody familiar with the Islamic tradition that every single systematic theology that was developed in classical and medieval Islam viewed the religion of Islam as being the sole path to God. And it's not just Muslims, we're talking at a time when pretty much every religion viewed itself in a similar manner. In fact, far from allowing salvation outside of the religion, the discussion was between the sects and whether other sects would be saved or not. By and large, the Mu'tazilites made takfir of the Ash'arites made takfir of the Hanbalites, all of them made takfir of the Falasifa and the Batinites, so on and so forth. But intra-Muslim polemics does not concern us here. The fact of the matter is that religious communities not belonging to Islam, the true other in our vernacular, were assumed to be outside the grace of God and in need of God's guidance. As far as I have read and researched, and I have read plenty of works of theology of all of these movements that we're going to talk about, the possibility of finding salvation in another religion while consciously and knowingly rejecting Islam was simply never even seriously entertained by any theologian or any scholar of any of the established schools of theology in the pre-modern era. The main theological issue that concerned classical and medieval theologians was not the salvific potential of other faiths, the absence of which was simply taken as a given, but rather the fate of those who had never heard of Islam or were exposed to falsified teachings. With regards to those who had never heard of Islam, the common term being tabligh al-risala, did they get the tabligh al-risala or not? The rationalist inclined Mu'tazilites, along with the Maturidis, they generally gave quite a lot of weight to the human intellect. Hence they believed that a person would be legally responsible, mukallaf, to reject idolatry and affirm a monotheistic vision of God, even if no revelation exists. Failure to do so warranted eternal punishment and damnation, because the mind, the rational mind, according to the Mu'tazilites, could potentially lead to monotheism. The Ash'arites, on the other hand, typically reactionaries against the Mu'tazilites in all of their doctrines, they claimed that anybody who had not heard of the message of Islam would be forgiven, even if they were pagans and idolaters. This was based on their theological premise that the human mind, independent of revelation, cannot judge good and evil. The tripartite categorization of Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali best illustrates this point. He categorizes mankind into basically three categories. Number one, people who have never heard of the message of Islam and who live in faraway lands, such as the Romans. these will be forgiven unconditionally. Number two, people who have been exposed to a distorted understanding of Islam and they have no recourse to authentic information, these too will be forgiven. The third category are those who have heard Islam because they live in the neighboring cities and the neighboring communities around Darul Islam, and they know the reality of Islam and they have access to authentic Islamic knowledge. These, according to Al-Ghazali, have no hope of salvation. The Hanbalite position manifested in the writings of Ibn Taymiyyah was that the intellect could discern right from wrong, and thus a sane, rational mind should logically come to the conclusion that there is an all-perfect God. Monotheism is logical. However, Ibn Taymiyyah argued, in God's infinite mercy and justice, God's punishment would not be meted out to any who had not been exposed to a messenger. In other words, even if logically you come to the conclusion that there is a God, until God tells you so, He's not going to punish you if you don't. Ibn Taymiyyah based this on many verses in the Quran, such as 17:15, we are not going to punish until we send a messenger. So according to Ibn Taymiyyah, those who didn't receive a message or received a distorted version of the message, they're neither automatically forgiven nor automatically punished. Rather, they shall be tested on Judgment Day with a special test. In any case, from this spectrum, what we see is that the main issue is whether God might possibly forgive any who have not been exposed to the teachings of Islam. The underlying assumption for all of these traditions is that Islam is the only path to God, and anyone who consciously, volitionally chooses Islam, chooses other than Islam, will simply not have it accepted on the Day of Judgment. Moving to the books of fiqh, in each and every one of the four established schools of Sunni law, in their chapters pertaining to apostasy, pretty much the number one example that all four Sunni schools of law mention in their books of fiqh is that if a Muslim claims that he is of another faith, or a Muslim claims that a person of another religion is morally in the acceptable region, it is permissible to be a Christian or a Jew, this would in fact count as grounds for apostasy. In other words, belief in the validity of a religious system was seen quite sincerely and casually as a rejection of Islam. And this is unanimous across the four Sunni schools, and I'm not an expert in the Shia school of law, but I'm pretty sure they would also say something similar. The question arises as to why there was so much unanimity with regards to this principle. I honestly think it is unfair, and honestly it's actually not very academic, to dismiss this overwhelmingly predominant position because of, let's say, calling it a literalist tendency. The Mu'tazilites are not literalists. Or to accuse all of these theologians of having a fear of the other, or of having selfish motives of wanting God's mercy on themselves and not wanting it on others. I honestly believe that those theologians and scholars were better individuals than we are, and their motives were more pure than our own. They were brave enough to discuss many controversies, including God and the nature of God. And yet, amazingly, this issue of the salvific potential of other religions was unanimously agreed upon by all of them. And the reason for this appears to be that there were numerous clear and explicit Quranic evidences. So clear, in fact, that despite the fact that these groups couldn't agree about the nature of God, they could agree that the only path to God was this religion of Islam. Islam with a capital I, as we're going to come to. The number of evidences that are quoted in works of theology, and especially in books of tafsir, the number of evidences are so numerous that honestly many doctoral dissertations could be written on specific individuals. And what I've done for the sake of brevity is to categorize these evidences under categories, numbers of verses under each category, and I'll emphasize the category with some examples of the verses. And in fact, for every category I mentioned, I'll mention only 4. There are literally dozens, if not hundreds of verses that support these categories. The first category, verses that suggest the religion of Islam is the only acceptable religion to God. We've heard such verses for the last day and a half. And of these verses, Professor Ramadan quoted them, and other speakers as well. The only religion in the eyes of God is Islam. Whoever seeks a religion other than Islam, it shall not be accepted of him, and in the hereafter he shall be of those who are lost. Many times we neglect two factors about these verses. Number one, the